good evening and a warm welcome, maybe a hot welcome to tonight's convening as a very important debate that we're having. And I say the word hot because I think what we've done in the last few weeks has been particularly hot, particularly strong, I think. Let's reflect what we've done. Week 1, quality education, critically important in South Africa. Week 2, the important issue of anchoring democracy. Week 4, that's next week, healing and reconciliation, all very, very important. So what about the missing week? This week, week 3, it's about economic transformation. And I have to say, if I reflect on myself, for the very first time, we voted on the 27th of April, 1994, and my uncle said, well, what do you feel about voting? And I gave him my thoughts. And then he asked me a question about what I felt about economic changes in the country. And myself said, at this point in time, it doesn't matter. I'm voting for the first time in my life. I don't want to think about that. Of course I'm naive, and I was naive then, because as we know, voting doesn't actually change your life if there's no economic transformation in a country. That's the issue we're facing right now. So welcome indeed to the show. Now, when I say welcome, there's many ways you can interact. You'll be probably watching us on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. And you can do this not just watching. I would strongly urge you to ensure that other South Africans and people born outside of South Africa, but visiting the country as well, or maybe working here, are part of this very important debate, this very important dialogue. Because central to all of this is the issue of revisioning South Africa, probably looking at it in a very different way. In marketing speak, we talk about massive changes in how we approach existing problems in a country, because the old ways of doing so just doesn't work. When you are commenting, and we welcome your thoughts, okay, that hashtag convening essay is an important one for you to use. It allows us to amplify the discussion well beyond the show. So we'll talk for just under an hour. And many people have already sent us questions in advance. If you've done just that, well, thumbs up to you, okay? For the rest of you, you can still do that, even comment as the show or this debate proceeds. So what then? Who's going to talk about this important issue insofar as the convening essay economic transformation debate? Well, I've got 3 people who I think are central to so many things of what we do in our country. The thought of a former Deputy Minister of Finance is always going to be how you're going to be introduced, right? And that's the former Deputy Minister, Mcebisi Jonas. Thank you for your time. Also, one of the 4 presidential investment envoys appointed by President Ramaphosa. I understand that he's been tasked with raising $100 billion to South Africa in the next 5 years. That's a massive, massive responsibility. He's also been the former chair of the Public Investment Company. So good of you to spend the next hour with us, and I think the viewers would absolutely appreciate that as well. The second of the guests we have is Duma Qubule, who's the founder of CEDT, the Center for Economic Development and Transformation, amongst many other things, being a former financial journalist. That book that I haven't quite read, which I need to do it, Making Mistakes, Righting Wrongs, in this case, Insights into Black Economic Empowerment. And then, besides that, his involvement in the past with COSATU, I think in many ways makes you a very important guest for the show. So welcome to the show as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
And Conveningsa Gasa, whose articles and tweets that I do not miss because they're always important. Even when she says she's tired of whatever people say, she's got strong opinions on a range of issues. A gender activist, a political analyst, somebody I've chatted to very often on my own shows that I've done. A long time ago, ANC Commissioner on Women Emancipation could be relevant to our discussion tonight. And then I found this interesting. She was involved in Nigeria with an organization called IDEA, which is Democracy and Electoral Assistance in Nigeria. But she has a particular interest around the issue of intersection of land, living custom, construction of identities, and traditional leadership. Some may say that combination puts her, in fact, absolutely at the center of some of the most important issues in our country. So welcome indeed to the show, and thanks for joining us.
Hi, thank you very much.
All right.
Thank you for having me.
Let's then get to all 3. I'm going to ask all 3 of the same question, okay? If the basic discussion is around economic transformation, from your point of view first up, help us answer this question. South Africa would have economically transformed when? And maybe fill in the blanks there.
Look, I mean, it would have been transformed when I think we change, broadly speaking, ownership patterns in our economy. And that also speaks to the need to deal with inequality, which is deep-rooted and growing, actually not going the opposite direction. And secondly, I think if its economic performance improves, just in terms of growth numbers, etc., and also reduce the number of the poor, and youth participation in our economy is broadly increased, and improve the skills formation and human capital in our economy, which is a big problem because of our failing
so
education
those would be amongst
system.
the barometers. Your thoughts on that same question? You know it's transformed when what happens?
You know what? You started off by saying that, talking about the hope that you had when we went to the elections in '94. So if you look at between 1994 and 2017, whichever way you cut and slice the information, it's been a deep disappointment in terms of economic transformation. As the former deputy minister was saying, that if you look at it in terms of GDP per capita, it's been a big disappointment. But what I've been studying lately is that we are now in the worst post-apartheid economic crisis. So what has happened is that since the global financial crisis, our economy has just ground to a halt. So what does this mean in practice? It means between 2009 and 2017, our economy grew by 1.6% a year. And if you measure that in per capita terms, we grew by 0.3% per year. And that is the economic equivalent of standing still. Now, many people like to, and what has happened over that period is that unemployment has grown by about 3.65 million people to 9.5 million people. So what you have today in South Africa is that using the expanded, more realistic unemployment rate, we have 41% black Africans unemployed. In the Eastern Cape, where half of my family comes from, it's at a frightening 46%. So where we are now, and is that we will reach what a Tunisia moment in South Africa, where a police shoots a hawker and the whole thing just erupts. I think we're approaching that moment very soon.
Okay, so therefore, that point, economic transformation for you will happen when what happens?
Yeah, in successful countries, they double. I've studied a lot about East Asia. They tend to have, most of the successful countries in East Asia, they have a mobilizing vision and plan. And each of the mobilizing visions and plan, they say we'll double the size of the economy every 10 years. And we will grow by 7% a year. And that is how they double in size. Now, if you look at that happened in Japan, they had an income doubling plan. It happened in Malaysia. They said, in fact, in Malaysia between 1990 and 2000, they're going to increase the economy 8 times between, I think, 1970 and 2000. And they did do that, So I think we need to, as South Africa, get our economic performance moving. There's no other way. Now, a lot of people blame the global financial crisis, and that is completely not true.
I want to pick up on that, what the causes may be. Namunusa, give us the first crack on that one. This vision, South Africa is economically transformed when what happens?
Well, firstly, when we have a clear policy on policy and vision on what the land means in this country, what our policy as a society is on land, when we understand that land is of no value in and of itself until you attach that value. And then when we translate the value that we attach onto land and ensure that we use that to address a number of issues that land stands for, the history of this country, ownership of property, of land, access to land, both urban and rural, understanding where the resources of this country come from. For example, we would have economically transformed when we understand that some of the critical resources of this country do not come from urban South Africa, actually come from a land that is what is called in post-apartheid speak traditional communities, which in the past were the Bantustans. Iron ore is in KZN. Platinum belt is in what we would consider rural northwest. So when we are able to figure out how to balance where we get the resources from land and how the people from whom the resources actually are taken, from whose land the resources are taken, who suffer the most, who have silicosis, who have all these kinds of conditions, are able to say we have something to show in the same way that your urban, so-called unregistered, undocumented people that is in shanty towns and all that, you would have had economic transformation when we are able to revise how we use the urban space, how we revisit the apartheid planning and spatial design, when we begin to envision that African people don't have to live in RDP houses, and that we have resources perhaps to think through this and put this in place. So for me, South Africa would have economically transformed, on the way towards economic transformation, when we look at different kinds of models that we can use on the land question, and look at land as a critical resource.
As a vehicle.
As a critical resource, both in terms of what is on the surface, but also in terms of what is below the surface. And in terms of what is on the surface, of course, the forestry, then all the natural resources, all the what we call primary resources, fisheries, and all these things. When we are able to say, what is enough for you? What is enough for this person? I think we would have been moving towards economic transformation.
Okay, it's an interesting thought to bring up. From my point of view, and I'll give you my simple formula that I've used often to say, away from rural, because I'm very much a city boy, right? That when townships look like suburbs and you can't make out the difference, then you would have known the country has dramatically changed, which, as you know, is not the case at all. So why then is the issue of economic transformation particularly important? But perhaps you can help us with that, former deputy minister. Critically, why is it that important?
Does the gentleman have a name, actually?
Well, yes, I suppose so. Go ahead.
Okay.
We've introduced him beforehand.
Look, I mean, it is fundamentally important that we transform our economy. I mean, think about it. By and large, I think we are still a commodity-based economy to begin with, highly reliant on commodity trade and commodity prices, as it were. So I mean, and of course, notwithstanding the fact that we're messing up with policy around mining, for instance, over the last couple of years, I think we could have, if we had better strategy for investment and growth in the sector, we probably would have generated better results and be more competitive in the sector. Putting that aside, I think we remain in that space. I mean, that's why I think the 2008 crisis impacted so negatively upon South Africa. And even at a point when South Africa was growing, we didn't invest much in the productive sector. I mean, as it were. I think we grew a consumptive budget, understandably so. We have to grow education. We have to ensure that we invest in health, etc., public health, etc., improvements. But I think many countries who survived the crisis did so primarily because there was a lot of investment in a period where there was growth in the productive sector. Manufacturing was a focus and it was growing, etc., etc. And in South Africa, we have not done that very well, except for the auto sector, where government has actually had a sizable.
But you see, in many other countries in the world, if we ask the question about economic transformation of a country, let's say whether it's the example of Asia came up earlier, so whether it's India to going further down to Singapore or Korea, etc. That economic transformation would talk about just how the country goes about and does its business and how it impacts on its citizens. In the South African context, does economic transformation mean colour?
It does.
Colour change.
In part it does. I mean, because what you're saying is that you've got to deal with historical realities. I mean, and historical reality is that you have embedded inequality, which is racial in character, but also you have, a legacy of Bantu education in part, and a host of those things, and the spatial realities of apartheid.
Would you agree with that economic transformation in South Africa is not just about changing economic systems, for example, but it must impact on the racial demographic that we have?
Yes, but I just want to step back before I answer that. So these countries that I've looked at, so they had a mobilizing vision. They had the state capacity to transform the economy. It always starts with the state capacity. Then they had a massive upgrading of human capital. And it's like quite mind-boggling, the things that they achieved on the human capital side, access to education on a mass scale. And they did industrial upgrading. So what it means is that they create jobs for the profile of the people they currently have. And most of those countries, the people were as uneducated as South Africa, and as the people got more educated, they created jobs up the value chain. And then the last thing is that they had the use of macroeconomic policy tools. They used multiple tools, they had multiple objectives, and so I believe that the system which we're using to govern our macroeconomic policy is a bit, what can I say, it's a bit outdated compared to what those countries did. Now, on the land, to get to your question, I think economists are not sure where to put the land in this thing. Some people would say it's a factor of production and so forth, yeah. But anyway, so now ownership is critical. I've spent a lot of time discussing, you might be surprised about ownership. So there's a lot of fake statistics around black ownership on the stock exchange, and the ones that I do are the correct ones.
Okay, there you are.
So let me start. So one of the topics that we had here was to discuss financialization. So we have excessive financialization in our economy. You've got a stock exchange that is 3 times our GDP.
Okay, help us explain the word financialization.
Okay, so financialization is a process whereby finance feeds on itself and it grows faster than the economy without expanding the productive base. So there are very many indicators to measure it, and he's written about it, but I just wanted to focus on one. So when we look at the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, black ownership is about 2.8% of the shares on the JSE, and the way I measure it, I look at actual shares and subsidiaries at the subsidiary levels, but the majority of the JSE has got nothing to do with South African economy. So about 2/3 of the JSE, this is part of the financialization program, we allowed these massive inward listings of companies like AB InBev, which just distorted everything in the JSE. And you have this Naspers animal, which accounts for 20% of the JSE, and it's in China. So we allowed this thing. I don't understand why we actually allowed it, because it increases our vulnerability to external shocks in the economy, because all these dividends are flowing out and so forth. But anyway, so if you strip out the non-South African assets, black ownership is about 7%, 8%, 7.5%, and it's by coincidence, that's the same amount that we have achieved for land, from what I've read, about 7 to 8%.
And just to confirm, non-South African assets, therefore,
you strip out
how much? Not so much in black, in terms of what percentage of non-South African assets are held in South Africa?
No. Okay, so on the JSE, 2/3 of the JSE it's got nothing to do with the South African economy.
Okay, that gives us the answer.
Yeah.
Let's get your thoughts. You spoke about land up front as an issue around economic transformation. What do you propose needs to happen there?
Well, I mean, firstly, you say that the land is it corresponds with the JSE figures in terms of black ownership, which is around 7.8%. In reality, those figures in terms of land are actually also huge distortion, right? Because what has been transferred under the so-called redistributive program of the land and development, land and rural development, actually has been dismal failure. So you would put the success at 3%, if that much. And if you break it down, that 3% also would, the companies or the beneficiaries that have succeeded are the ones who've gone the big commercial route and partners with companies like Triple Z, 7, and so on and so forth. So you need to unpack that. But most importantly, former Deputy Minister of Finance has raised an important issue around the fact that our manufacturing sector in this country is very low. But it is the story of this continent. It is the story of this continent which reproduces raw materials and sends them elsewhere, and then receives them
and pays a
and
higher
then
price
sell them. And for me, that is critical to land, actually. So when people say land is, there are so many ways in which people talk about land and the economy. It's as if it's on the side. It's like on the side. Actually, it isn't. The gold that you take and you send elsewhere, and then it comes back and it has value because now it has more value because it has been processed. It actually comes from land. Platinum, that's the same thing, right?
So therefore,
forestry in the context of climate change, right, forestry, you've got to look differently on how land intersects on everything, actually.
So therefore,
so hold on.
right.
So you look at habitat, housing, you look at production, you look at all these things, and you have to see that all these things are connected. If you decide you're going to build houses in this place or build a new city in this place, you've got to answer. That's what many countries are moving towards. What's the impact on primary resources, forestry, water, all these things? And we as South Africans, we are not anywhere closer to that. And here I'm not even talking about peri-urban settlements. I'm talking about the bishops' courts, even, because there is no regard for the fact that land and whatever is derived from land is not an infinite resource.
So here's the thought. The issue of land right now is not just an economic debate, it's a political debate, right? So let's say
more than that.
Right, and far more. Without spending too much time on it, let's just say it finally gets resolved, okay, in some way or the other.
It won't.
When it did you say it?
No, it won't.
It won't get resolved.
Unless you have a completely different thought process and you don't look at land and saying, oh, we'll deal with the few who have been dislocated, maybe a little bit of restitution here and there. Unless you actually, all South Africans, including the rich ones are paying tax now by billions, unless they all look at what is the centrality of land in this
Okay, so let's just say, and I will pick up on the problems, but let's just say it is resolved, okay? How then would it be expected to change South Africa? So tomorrow morning we wake up, the land issue is resolved.
Firstly, we'd have different cities. Firstly, your cities would look differently. Secondly, your architecture would look differently because you would think you don't have endless forests, so you can't just use natural resources willy-nilly. Thirdly, you would look at fishery rights. You would look at water usage, how you build your houses, how you build your city, how you plan your city, the color, the texture, color in terms of race, the texture, and everything that goes with that would be very different. A number of countries are actually doing this. Australia is in fact now saying they can no longer talk about land as an independent, but they have to talk about land in relation to other ministries that they have, including the vexed question of the Aboriginal.
Okay. Let me pick up on that. So the Conveningsa made the point that issue won't be resolved unless. Okay. What are your thoughts?
Look, I mean, tapping on the issue, I think the where we are, my view, of course, is that we're at a point, because of all these factors that we're talking about, if you like, the national kind of social contract that we had in '94 is crumbling. Actually, effectively. That's what
so let's get right. The social contract of '94
is crumbling. Because, I mean, remember that it was based on a consensus about the kind of economy we're building, the political architecture of the country, and everybody theoretically has a stake in that. So what are you finding happening now because of all of these things, poor economic performance and the failure to deal with some of the land issues? And in fact, the debate of land, for instance, needed to start by assessing why have we not implemented the policy that we adopted in '94.
Absolutely.
And once you start looking at that, for me, it comes back to the issue of state capacity and the capability of the state. So you had policy, and you can't pretend as if from '94 up to now there was no policy. There was policy.
And therefore did state, and you were part of it, did it have capability and capacity?
You have to deal with the issue of state capability to move forward as a critical component in the puzzle, in the big puzzle. But the point I wanted to make is that there is a need for a new conversation in this country about, firstly, how do we deal with the dismal economic performance that we've had up to now? How do we kind of address issues of inequality? How do we address, issues of growth? Because, there are sacrifices that we have to make in order to achieve growth in all across the board. We have to ensure that there's domestic capital invests more in our economy, what do we need to do to get them to put more in that? We have ensured that productivity increases and a whole range of other things that we need to do. So there is a need for a new conversation that begins to shape a new economic vision.
A new conversation, ironically, we call ourselves Convening SA, and it is in many ways a conversation that we are having with you being the entire country. You reflect and represent the entire nation. So hashtag Convening SA, let other people join
because
look at some of the points there, yeah?
Of course, if you don't do that, the danger, because I think the problems are so big.
Yeah.
The danger that we're facing, we're looking in their faces, that people are likely to take short-term solutions.
Oh, yeah.
To problems that require a long-term view.
Okay.
And it might actually come back to bite us. And we also have the rise of populism given.
All right. Are people taking, when I say people, government, business, activists, are they taking and looking for short-term solutions to this
what
problem?
amazes me is that you have the three main, I was at NEDLAC last week presenting on the things that you're talking about. So you have the ANC, the three major parties, the DA, you have the EFF, then you have the social partners, business, labor. None of them have put on the table a plan to get us out of this crisis. So at NEDLAC last week, Monday and Tuesday, they were asking many of us to come up and put forward plans as to how to get us out of this crisis. So I agree with Mcebisi that what we need is almost like a reset button. Start again, a new conversation, whatever you want to call it.
Can I throw in this word, economic Codesa, which was discussed before?
Yes, I think we do. We need an economic Codesa. But the problem, the president has announced that he wants a summit on the economy, but we have seen where the previous summits happened. Let me start. We had 1998, the Job Summit. Then we had the Growth and Development Summit in 2003. We've had so many of these things, but the problem was that the government tried to dictate what could be discussed and what could not be discussed. So I'm saying if you start dictating and prescribing what is off the table, they said macroeconomic policy is off the table, it can't be discussed, so it's a waste of time. So I think we should discuss everything. The land issue, we should discuss everything.
Put differently, I think there should be no holy cows.
Thank you.
So
That's what I mean.
Which means playing outside the rules of parliament. I'm sure you have much to say about economic Codesa and whatever.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, firstly, I have a very serious problem in calling it economic Codesa because that in itself is very limiting. I think one of the things that we have in this country that has happened, and none of us thought it would ever happen to us, is that we are suffering from a crisis of imagination. You know, the majority of people who put forward policies suffer from a crisis of imagination. And until we get over that and say, as Mcebisi says, that we need to revisit the social compact in 1994 and agree that it may have been okay for them, and there are certain lessons that we have learned, and assess and look at what it is, what kind of social compact we would be looking at now. I think firstly that would have to be a very honest assessment of where we have succeeded and where we have failed and the mistakes that we have made. And secondly, it would have to look at how do we view a number of institutions. You know, private sector is one. The institution of traditional leadership is another, especially in relation to land and in relation to democracy. And all these things, and one of the things that I think we're beginning to learn is that all these things are actually intersecting and very interlinked. So it requires some level of confidence in ourselves to say that, listen, it might be very difficult, but we think it can be done.
Okay, so 2 points out of that. Economic Codesa is very limiting, so I'm going to rely on you to maybe coin a new phrase. What, and hopefully it'll gain currency, which is an interesting word to use. What would be that phrase, if not economic Codesa?
I'm not into phrases.
Then
actually,
what
generally, I'm on Twitter, but I'm not into hashtags.
A convention.
I think a conversation. I think a conversation. A series of conversations, reimagining South Africa from where we are. You know, from a very honest assessment of where we are, and I don't think that's going to happen with one conversation, by the way.
Absolutely.
You know,
many
I think there are going to have to be many conversations. One of the things that we didn't do in the 90s that I think we have to learn now is that we didn't build into the system how are we going to get together as a people periodically and say, are we still with it? You know, and if we need to veer, you know, in a different direction, and then have a conversation
we meet
with
up,
that, and you know, and talk to
Okay,
each other.
so let me put it this way. I mean, whatever we're saying is all very, very important. And a person watching may say, but that's what Parliament is for. They
No,
meet
actually,
regularly.
that's part
Where's
of
the
problem.
difference? Yeah.
That's part of the problem. The problem is that Parliament are elected representatives. Government has its own responsibility. I think that one of the lessons that we learned in the early 90s or towards the end of, beginning of 90s was actually a civil society. Civil society is a very problematic
term,
concept. Yeah, but was a situation where a citizenry, right, disengaged, because we now have all the people from exile. We had our leaders out of prison. We had our elected representatives. And I think it's important to say that, yes, Parliament has a role. Yes, government has a role, but that citizens, in fact, are the pulse of society.
Will Parliament, and maybe the examples as in Fees Must Fall, but overall, is it not accurate to say that Parliament really won't allow that? Because
I'm sorry.
if they
You're
don't,
not going to convince
there's a
me of
power
that.
on the outside.
You are never going to convince me of that. I am a product of the 1980s,
Okay.
right? I'm a product of that time when there was state of emergency. I know what citizens can do. I know what ordinary people can do.
But
And
does our
it need
current
not-
Parliament have the appetite? What I'm saying is they may
Well,
be
that
forced to
parliament
do it.
did. That parliament didn't have appetite either. But what we can do now, because it need not necessarily be hostile, but you do need to have. I'll give you an example, right? Last year, when people were saying, "Well, this is South African speak, so I'll speak as I do," when people were hurtful,
I knew you were going to say that.
yes,
yeah.
when people
But
were
okay.
hurtful with Zuma, right? And not just Zuma and everything and everybody else that went with it, people were out in the street, right? But as soon as that which was in your face was removed, people then
Retreated.
disengaged,
Yeah.
right? And forgot that it wasn't about an individual. It was about a system that had reproduced and reproduced itself. A system, by the way, that we inherited from apartheid in so many different ways. And so the danger now is that you may think you dealt with that, and you might have a rude awakening that you actually haven't, or a new phenomenon is being born, right? And so I think it's important for people actually, for example, Conveningsa Africa is one of the important platforms, but there should be many others. But it shouldn't just be talk shops, you know, it should be what people were doing.
But okay, interesting point. If it's not a talk shop, you see, my concern about it is who in Parliament is going to allow a discussion outside of Parliament to have the muscle that will impact on change at Parliament?
Look, I mean,
Willingly, that is.
think about it. I mean, policy at the moment, it's normally driven from the perspective of the ruling party. I mean, it cut the frills. I mean, of this debate. So I think
it's not
the
even
argument,
Parliament, it's one party.
ultimately, that's the case. Is your problem is increasingly that politics should change in some way.
Yeah.
I mean, in a sense. I mean, because I think what you are arguing is that in '94 you had a national consensus
Yeah.
to say we're cutting
With apartheid.
with apartheid and we're moving in a particular direction, and these are the frameworks. We adopted constitution and a number of other things and so on and so on, and we created a particular hope about economic transformation, about all of these things that we're talking about now. Now, the extent of the crisis, I mean, you ran the numbers about the numbers of the unemployed and et cetera, we are near a crisis if we're not at a kind of a crossroads in a sense. Because if we do not grow the economy moving forward, if we don't increase investment in our economy, relatively, and if we don't improve education outcomes in our economy, but I think we create at least some national obsessions around education,
so
around growth,
okay.
around all of these things. I tell you now that we probably will have a different country in a couple of years.
So how then do we
So
reach
it's a
national
crisis.
consensus? I mean,
No,
to
I
the
think
point
that
where
what you were
you've
saying,
got the ruling
we need
party
to have
or the governing
Yeah,
party.
we need to have
Yeah.
many parallel conversations. Last weekend, I was at the mining summit. We were trying to forge a new vision for. Now, in 1994, there were many civil society formations. If we're discussing education, there's a National Education Crisis Committee. If you're discussing local government, there were NGOs like Plan Act. If you're discussing that were engaging these things, and there were so many of them. So let's just think. We have to talk about mining. We have to talk about land. I was with the doctors recently. We're talking about national health, and when you mention the numbers that we have to do to make this thing, this dream of national health insurance a possibility, you're talking about huge numbers. You're talking about complex issues. When you talk about the education system, to reset the education system, start from scratch. I liked the analogy that you used when you says the township. You won't see the difference between the township and the suburbs. So one of the things that we did, and we listened to the wrong people, was that we didn't equalize the two education systems. We didn't equalize the two health systems. We listened to this propaganda that we were spending 6% of GDP on education and we shouldn't spend more. But if you look at Malaysia in the book that I did, I told you in the foreword, the president of Malaysia, he says, during our catch-up phase, we spent 11% of GDP, and once we had stabilized, we went back to the 6%. So that's what you do in the catch-up. You initially incur higher expenditures in rebuilding these institutions, and then you normalize to what normal countries do.
That didn't
But
happen.
I do need to say this. I do need to say this. When you say Parliament is not going to allow this, I think it's very important that we take lessons from what has been happening in the last 10 years.
in our country.
Yeah.
Okay.
If rural women in particular and other alliances of rural people had not said the traditional courts bill is not going to go in the way that it does because it cuts on our rights, it does this, that, and the other. If they didn't do that and risked, as we speak, there are people in KZN who don't sleep in their homes, right? They stopped it. The ruling party in 2013 had to allow it to lapse because there was no consensus in the provinces, in the ruling party itself, right? Eastern Cape had a particular mandate, Mpumalanga, etc., especially the ones that were mainly rural, right? So it's also important to understand that Parliament is not this institution that sits there that is not impacted upon by what people say. When people went, I'm talking about people who had never been outside of their villages, let alone, just going to Durban, have never been on aeroplanes. When they went and talked to parliamentarians about their lived reality, in KZN, in Mpumalanga, in all these places, parliamentarians were ashamed. When Parliament went out and was forced to go and listen to people where they live, because that's what Rule 73 of Parliament says.
Do I
there's
take
a
it
way,
that you...
So there's a way in which even a small organized community or community of like-minded people who may not necessarily agree on everything and around a specific issue, as Duma says, right? There's a way in which that can have a ripple effect. You can look at that. For me, the Traditional Courts Bill is one of the very important case studies of post-apartheid South Africa that has not yet been studied closely.
Okay, maybe that issue of what's happening in KwaZulu-Natal is another good example of that.
Or
The issue
Eastern
of-
Cape, for that matter.
Well,
Or
absolutely. The
Mpumalanga.
issue of economic transformation is a critically important one, and that's what we're discussing here today. Hashtag convening SA. Now, we've asked people to contribute, and you can give us your opinions right away. We'll pick up some of them right now. Others will be answered even after the show. We'd also ask people to broaden the conversation, and you do that by just sharing what we're talking about right now, whether you're on Twitter, on YouTube, watching us on YouTube, or certainly on Facebook, as in Facebook Live. I've picked out some of the comments. Some people have commented even before the show. So I'm going to just pick out some of them that I think are really interesting. Incelia is saying, well, the current structure of the IPPs, introduces an unnecessary middleman. Furthermore, locks us into old technologies for periods up to 25 years in rapidly improving industries. It's unsustainable for Eskom to facilitate the loss of its customers. I'm just going to read out a couple of them because it gives us a sense of where we are, even if we can't answer all of them in one way. Ashraf Dakrat saying, one of the greatest scourges of our economic life is the devastating effect of interest and usury on our daily lives. Think banking in this case here. It affects the poorest as well. How do we curb the stranglehold the banks have on our people? Perhaps I'll throw in another one for us to consider, the issue of economic systems. We tend to adopt a capitalist system. Others talk about a socialist system. How many other systems are there absolutely working? Why don't we know about that one? Tumelo saying, with somewhat free education in South Africa, what's wrong with it if it keeps producing unemployable graduates? That issue of unemployable is another important one. Maybe the last one for now. Neil Coleman saying, in every country, just about the disproportionate economic clout of those at the top has provided these individuals with wildly disproportionate influence on their country's political life and on its media, on what policies are pursued and whose interests end up being ignored. Let me just see if I pick out one more. And thanks for the many people have done it over a range of different platforms here. Zanele Luana talking about Stratcom. Is Stratcom Media allowed to tell us about tough times? I think not. It's a whole lot more, but I'm not going to read all of that. Okay, they're just a range of some of the thoughts that's come through there. Let's then talk about. So I just want to stay with the issue of power of the people. Do we, and we meaning the four of us people watching us and the entire country, looking at the two recent, I mean, you gave the example of the traditional bill that you spoke about, right? There's a discussion going on in KwaZulu-Natal now around land, and we know that. But if you go back in the last few years, the issue of fees must fall and then decolonize education. All it started effectively from people, in this case, students, right? And they were able to set the agenda. Do you think, by and large, that as part of this national debate around economic transformation and a whole range of other issues, that people generally underestimate just how much power they have? So what I think, students come in, give us ideas, make changes, then step out, and we've seen that with others as well. But overall, do we fully understand just how much power people have outside of Parliament?
Of course. I think we also patronize people. I think it's a very interesting thing. So, on the one hand, we either sort of like have this very patronizing attitude towards this thing called the people. And here I'm talking about the poor, in whose name all these things are done. And then on the other hand, have this sanctimonious thing that everything they do is right, and forget that they too are part of the system. So if you talk about, let me just backtrack a bit. If you talk about state capture, for example, right? It's not just about rands and cents, right?
What is it about?
It is also about how it has altered the culture of this country. It's about how it has social consequences, the social cost, the social damage at every level, right? You go to any community, it doesn't matter the political party, by the way, whether it's DA or whatever. I mean, I've been to communities where people are no longer bearing each other, right? That's the extent of that's the extent of the level of social damage that you get. So we also need to look at that. Secondly, there will always be people who ignite, a certain action and a certain thought process. So whether it is students, whether it is rural people, whether it is workers, whether it is, anybody, what is important is that we also need not romanticize them, because another form of patronizing is when you romanticize people. So when students come and say fees must fall, we then need to sit around the table properly and say, what are the consequences of this? How do we go about this? Because if you don't discuss it properly, you are in fact going to have kind of cynical policies where you say, okay, we'll do that just to make it go away. And then it doesn't go away.
Anyway, yeah.
So you've got to have to think about, when you talk about decolonization, right? My preoccupation at UCT is about how you don't look at customary law as separate from other law, right? How you look at customary marriages in line with, together with Muslim marriages, together with Judaic marriages, together with civil marriages and so on. That's what decolonization ought to be, because there is no little corner of South Africa that exists in and of itself.
It's a good point. Let me then pick up on and I'll get both your thoughts on this one. That, you know, that there are many, we could have this discussion just on the technical aspects of an economy, but I think that will take far too long. We'll probably need 2-3 hours. But central to South Africa's problems is it fair to say that human rights and social justice is not central to our economic policies, and it should be if it's not? Your thoughts on that?
Yes, but Ashraf, I'm really concerned about, we've got a present crisis. And then what I was saying earlier on is that South Africa, in the same period, 2009 to 2017, we've underperformed every region in the world. Yeah, let me give you an example. The world economy over the same period has grown by 5%. The world economy has grown by 3.8%. Emerging markets have grown by 5%. Emerging and developing Asia has grown by 7%. So you go down, 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 and then you get to South Africa, which has grown by 1%. So South Africans must not believe that what is happening is because of the global situation.
Yeah.
The global situation recovered long ago.
So our competitors are actually doing very well.
Our competitors are doing very well. So we should ask ourselves, why is it only South Africa? So I would say there were the wrong policies that we followed after 2009. And I'll give you 2 examples. So the first thing that we did that was wrong, our central bank started, the global financial crisis started in 2007, and it went on until 2008, 2009. So our central bank started increasing interest rates before the global financial crisis, 250 basis points. And then after June 2007, they continued increasing interest rates. Now, in the other countries, what did they do? They implemented expansionary monetary and fiscal policies to counter the loss of demand from exports from the rich countries, which collapsed during 2009. So we didn't do that. Our central bank was increasing interest rates against every single central bank in the world was cutting interest rates. So what I'm trying to say, and then the fiscal stimulus that happened in these countries was huge. The United Nations estimated that this fiscal stimulus of 48 the largest emerging markets, for which data is available, was about 5% of GDP in those countries. That is a huge number. If you look at China, just after the global financial Lehman, 2008 September, 2 months later they announced a $600 billion stimulus. And the following year they announced a doubling of the state loans from the state-owned companies to about 1.4 trillion rands. So the Financial Times estimated that the Chinese stimulus was about 15% of GDP. Now, what she was saying is that we lack imagination in what we can do to get us out of this crisis. So we have to employ extraordinary tools that have not been. So the lesson when you look at the Great Recession of the 30s and the Great Recession of the 10 years ago is that you have to implement like really bold policies to counter what is happening in the global situation.
Let's talk about imagination.
I just wanted to stress though, I agree probably broadly. But I think for me the central issue is you cannot erode the capacity of the state and hope to achieve better results in terms of the performance of the economy.
So your understanding of eroding the capacity of state would be what? State capture, corruption?
Let's face it, from 2008 onwards, we have seen key institutions of the state being destroyed, effectively. For a host of other regions, for a host of reasons. Some of the reasons relate to state capture, but others relate just to pure bad deployment, and others are bad policies sometimes, and et cetera. And for me, I believe strongly that without strong institutions in your economy, you are likely to have bad results. Now, that's the one point that I think that's important. So thinking about changing path and changing direction should also be about remodeling our institutions, rebuilding our institutions, enhancing capacity.
Statecraft itself.
Besides the imagination, because it's been eroded.
Part of it is that we need to move away from this thing, and I seriously believe that this thing of looking at institutions in electoral cycles is problematic. So, what you have over the last couple of years, is that the new minister changes DG, and he probably gets changed in a year down the line. The new one changes the DGs and so on and so on and so on. And you have the same thing with CEOs of SOEs, boards of SOEs, and et cetera, et cetera.
Isn't that a
But
weakness
more-
of democracy?
No.
it's
Let me
not.
give you an
No,
example.
it's
I was
not.
at the Department of Transport.
Right.
I'll mention it long ago. And the new minister arrived after the previous minister died. And the people that I was reporting to, nothing happened for a year. Yeah.
That's what happens.
Nothing. Everything had frozen.
So
He tried to have a
transport,
meeting.
nothing was moving, ironically.
Yeah, for a year. Yeah, nothing.
So the point, I think the
Yeah,
lesson,
agreed.
one of
Yeah.
the lessons, if you look at advanced countries, etc., one of the lessons is creating
Continuity, yeah.
sustainable institutions with continuity that cuts across political regimes.
Oh,
If you fail to do that, the likelihood of impacting on
But for the
development,
political
on the
bias,
economy,
isn't
et
the
cetera,
weakness
et
of that
cetera,
that political
et cetera.
parties won't buy into that? You know, we speak about the ruling of the
It's
governing
happened in
party.
many countries.
It
but you've got
happens.
the
It's
EFF and the
happening.
DA,
It's
yeah.
happening in many countries. I mean,
But
it's
isn't
happening.
that the weakness?
But there's
It's-
no, but
I don't
there's
think. I don't. For me, I
Yeah.
think it's we've always assumed that there's correlation. I mean, let's take it. Good education is important for everyone.
Outside of election cycles.
Yeah,
for example.
outside of elections.
It's not for ANC members.
It's not for ANC members. It's not for DA members. It is good for everyone.
yeah.
Growth is fundamentally important for everyone. So and that's why I'm saying the national conversation, apart from doing
yeah.
other things, is just to set basic rules about what we consider important in this country. What is our obsession?
One of the conversations
You can't
that
have
we
you can't
never
have a
had.
country that
Yeah.
says growth is an incident. It's coincidental.
Well, what's
Good
the difference therefore
education
between,
outcomes.
between economic transformation, which is what we're talking about, and radical economic transformation?
Sure.
It's like, does radical mean like catch up? You know, when a
Le- le-
learner
le-
doesn't go to
le-
school for 10 months and they need to pass an exam in the 11th month.
Well, I mean, for
The-
me, the yeah. Okay. Mcebe.
Look, I mean, for me, again, I'm not hung up on concepts. All what I'm saying is that we have to change path as a country. I mean, that's all
yeah.
what I'm saying. Part of it is about ensuring that we have certain basic things that we all prioritize and agree on. You know, like the one is around growth. If we don't grow the economy, we've actually stuffed. And if we can do that as quickly as possible, we're gone. If we can't ensure that we increase investment in our economy, both domestic and foreign investment, because I think, again, domestic investment is so fundamentally important, but also investment in particular sector. I mean, the labor intensivity of our economy is very low. And we've got to improve and drive improvements in that space, as it were. Again, the issue of ensuring that you broaden participation in our economy, inclusivity, is fundamentally important. Now, for me, that if you can do that, we have not been able to do that. That's radical enough for me.
Okay,
Well,
and just
we've not
very
been
quickly,
able
we're
to
going to
do
wrap up shortly. That initial point about yourself being one of those 4 wise people, male, female, to raise $100 billion in 5 years. Well, how far down the track are you on doing that?
Look, I mean, there are two advantages we have, though I don't know, Mr. Kubul, what your point, what your comment is. The two advantages we have at the moment, I think, in part, the global economic environment is improving. I mean, whether we like it, with some problems there and there, but generally, it's generally going in the right direction, which is good. I mean, for us. But secondly, linked to that, of course, is new technologies, artificial intelligence, and all those things that are happening, which has huge potential to create a new wave of industrialization in South Africa that we can have. The second one is that, let's face it, I mean, we have a moment after the last 10 years where it's a space where there is optimism in the country. And and for me, it
And yet the
provides
weekend
us.
paper says playtime is over, right?
It provides us with a basis for a real serious debate across all sectors of society.
But the debate is not happening at
It's
the
not
moment.
happening.
Yeah.
And we're not
Why is it not
exploiting that.
Let's to take on what Mcebisi was saying. The first quarter GDP went down 2.whatever%,
yeah.
and it was the worst performance in 9 years, despite this alleged increase in confidence. And the latest stats that are coming out suggest that we'll have another quarter of declining GDP growth. So it could be a recession. Now, if that doesn't cause South Africans to take it seriously, and I would argue, you know, there's ideology in economics, so you can't run away from it.
Yeah,
So there's in the Keynesian tradition, they say investment won't happen unless there's growth. So investment does not depend on policy certainty and those type of things, and business confidence. It depends on what Marxians would call the profitability of investment. So I don't see investment happening in a country that is not growing. Now, let me just tell you, there is a period in South Africa, a short period, where we did see economic growth.
Which was when?
Between 2004 and 2008. So we created 2 million jobs during that period. Unemployment came down, and it was a period of progress. Now, the reason why, we must ask ourselves, why did that happen? What happened then is that there was the end of the gear policy, there was the expansionary monetary policies, and there was expansionary fiscal policy. I saw one statistic from National Treasury which said that during that period, government expenditure had increased by 10% per year in real terms. Fixed investment was increasing. It went up to 24% from 18%. State-owned enterprises were investing again. So what I'm saying, as South Africans, we need to enter into a new phase of expanding our productive capacity as a country, and we now need to use emergency measures to get our economy growing again.
And maybe that point about radical thinking, isn't it?
Well, you know what, the thing is, whether it's, for me, my answer always to this thing about radical economic transformation, I always say that, well, the results will show, whether it is radical or not. And I think the point that Ncebisi is making and that that what we need to really talk about is when you don't have stability in the system, and this has got nothing to do with, invest in investing agencies and all these things. It's just about the stability in the country, right? So we've never in this country really had a conversation about statecraft, about the fact that there are certain functions that obviously are political appointments, but the rest of the bureaucracy does not need that,
and
right?
We probably need to do that soon.
So,
I'm going to leave it at that.
So once you have that stability, it makes it possible to say you can see further this and because things will continue, whether you have a new minister or you don't have a new minister.
Okay, we've got about a minute and a bit to go, so I'll leave it with each one of you to, you've got 20 seconds to make a particular pronouncement under this banner of economic transformation in terms of what's the one thing you'd do if we left you in charge with getting things right in one go. Go ahead, your side.
Look, I mean, the idea of convening a national conversation on transforming the economy, on creating stability in the country and changing direction in the country, and so that we drive everybody into a broad consensus around these issues is now.
The national conversation has to happen.
I've been on a one-person campaign. I'm advocating a 500 billion rand fiscal stimulus, which is 3% of GDP per year, and it can be financed by the private sector. I've presented to the Banking Association. They can provide half of it, and then we as a government, I don't work for government, sorry. The government
we as a country.
As a country, we can provide the other one. And there are ways we can do it imaginatively, and I was talking about restructuring our balance sheet. And the last thing I want to say is that, we've got this thing called the PIC.
No, very quickly.
Okay, it's got assets of 2.1 trillion. I think that's an obscene amount of cash that we have in that system. It's way out of kilter with any benchmark for a similar pension fund in any country in the world. Even if you compare it with the American Social Security Trust.
Can I leave it at that? Because I want to get you to give us 15 seconds of your final thoughts.
I think national conversations, but I also think that it's important to also identify what can be done now, right? Because there's we need to avoid the binaries of, either the national conversations or, I think there are certain things that can be done now. I think this current government, for example, on land, they are, whatever is debated on Section 25, but there are certain things that can be done now that can address what needs to be done, restitution, etc., etc., etc. So I think that it's very important, actually, for people to see and to feel that government is doing things now.
Well, let's leave it at that. Thank you for your time, all three of you. You raised some critically important issues. From your point of view, listening in or viewing us, that issue of the national conversation is important. You may ask that question Is the economy important to you specifically? Of course it's important. If a transformation of the economy is important to you and to the entire country, that the country's wealth overall of all the people changes radically so that all of us will, well, have a better life for all, then perhaps it's something you should be paying attention to. So as we try and instigate a national conversation on economic transformation, perhaps you need to be starting this at home and on your social media pages. Try and instigate that. Let's have that conversation. And the big thing around imagination. What exactly do we do about it? Check it out. I'd like to get your thoughts, and we'll certainly pick it up. And don't forget that hashtag ConveningSA. Bring the entire country into this conversation. Next week, that issue of reconciliation will come up. Looking forward to that.